The Arab world stays silent as Saudi journalist possibly murdered in a Saudi consulate, but no official reaction from any Arab government, no condemnation from the Arab media. What's behind the silence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Intelligence leaks to the media about missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi appear on almost a daily basis. Now reports are emerging about evidence proving he was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and that his smartwatch could potentially help solve the mystery. The Turkish newspaper Sabah, quoting security sources, says the journalist may have even recorded his own death. The audio of the moments when it's reported Khashoggi was interrogated, tortured and killed were apparently recorded by the smartwatch he was wearing and sent to both his phone and iCloud. His phones were with his fiancée, who was waiting outside the consulate on the day he went missing, the 2nd of October. Reports say Saudi Arabia had sent a hit squad of 15 men to Turkey. The Saudi Interior Minister says allegations there were orders to kill Khashoggi are baseless lies. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has vowed Saudi Arabia will face severe punishment if it's responsible for the journalist's disappearance. There's been worldwide outrage over Khashoggi's case, the international community's demanding answers and pressures growing on Saudi Arabia. But the reaction from the Arab world's politicians has been almost complete silence. The Arab Parliament Human Rights Committee met at the Arab League headquarters in Cairo last week. The disappearance of Khashoggi wasn't even discussed, and the Federation of Arab Journalists issued only a general statement calling for an investigation. Let's bring in the panel. Here in the studio, Mohammed Al-Masri, chairman of the journalism program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. In London, Saeed El-Shahabi, columnist at Al-Quds and leader of the Bahrain Freedom Movement. And from Amman, Dawood Khattab, board member of the International Press Institute. Welcome to you all. Let me start with you, Mohammed Al-Masri, first. Why the silence?
I think there are two primary reasons. First of all, we have to keep in mind that the Arab media environment isn't like the American or the British media environment. Arab journalists operate in a censorial culture. There isn't much freedom. There's a lack of journalistic professionalism. So these are problems that plague the Arab region. Now, specifically in terms of this case, you have two kinds of Arab journalists. There's the kind of Arab journalist that is fundamentally scared because there's this environment of fear. And then there's the Arab journalist, unfortunately, who is probably not terribly sympathetic, unfortunately, to Jamal Khashoggi, because they see him as representing the Muslim Brotherhood or Turkey or Qatar. So if you look at the Egyptian media, which I've been following loosely for the last few days, they've been they're not exactly pro freedom of the press. They're not pro Jamal Khashoggi, and they've launched into an array of sort of conspiracy theories about what may have happened. So that's kind of the surrounding context here.
Self-censorial. I mean, that's something that the journalists have probably quite rightly taking into consideration. I want to bring in our guest, Saeed El-Shahabi in London here. There is this thing about the Arab journalists being self-censoring themselves, but why are the Arab governments remaining so silent?
Thank you very much. But it is clear, of course, the Saudis have been taking the lead in the diplomacy of the Arab world for the past 30 years. In fact, they have been trying to replace Gamal Abdel Nasser, who died in 1970, as the leader of the Arab world. And of course, in the last few years, they have invested heavily in recruiting the Arab governments to its cause. I think also that after the Arab Spring in 2011, they have enforced their presence on the Arab political scene, and they have invaded Yemen, for example, for the past 4 years, almost 4 years now, and nobody is saying anything, even stop the war. So we are also aware that since 2014, They have killed 640 people, executed them, and nobody is saying a word because the Arab world has been muted, whether journalists or politicians. Many of those countries are depending on the giveaway or give out from the Saudi treasury. Of course, the Saudis themselves are now finding it difficult to continue financing their projects. But one thing is clear, that I remember in 1991 when they invited the foreign troops to attack Iraq, there were a lot of demonstrations and protests in the Arab world, especially in North Africa. Now everybody has been muted, everybody has been neutralized. But still, I can still see that the investment of the Saudis in the West has not really helped them very much this time, because the whole West is in turmoil against what the Saudis are said to have committed in Turkey by killing this journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So I believe
let me bring in now just to answer those claims. Dawood Qutb, you're in Amman right now. It used to be that the traditional capitals of the Arab world were Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad. Those places have their own problems now. They've been replaced, in effect, by Riyadh. And Riyadh have too much power?
Well, there's no doubt about it that the Arab press is owned a lot by two major financial sources. One of them obviously is Riyadh, but also the other is where you're based in Doha. And so a lot of people have to make decisions which side of the Qatari-Saudi conflict they're in for their own financial situation. The actual absence of real independently owned media is almost extinct here. We've had a few cartoonists who wrote and made the drawings of Jamal, asking where Jamal is. We had a cartoonist in Jordan who had showed the MBS Abaye as making Jamal Khashoggi disappear. I've written a few things about independent journalism, but it has been, as you said, a few and far in between. And the main reason, as you said, and your guests have said, is because the Saudis have basically controlled indirectly or directly most of the media and many of the governments.
So, Mohammed Al-Masri, we seem to be developing a narrative here that suggests that it's not just the Arab governments that aren't responding to this. It's because they control most of the Arab media. There's no independent media, which is why the independent media aren't responding to this either. Would you agree with that?
I don't think there's any question. I mean, the academic literature, for instance, is pretty consistent on that point. I think we also have to remember the larger political context here, which I'm referring to the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring comes along in 2011, and people think that this is going to be a watershed moment, something positive, that this is going to usher in all kinds of democratic change, independent and free media voices, and so on and so forth. But what the Arab governments, like the Saudi government and the Egyptian military, learned is that they had not been harsh enough, they had not been repressive enough. So they've launched a very intense counter-revolution. They've been more repressive than anything that we had seen prior to 2011. And so now you see this, it's kind of this Arab Spring effect, or the counter-revolutionary effect, where journalists are, as the other guests have said, are almost completely muted, either because they're on board with these autocratic agendas, or because they're terrified.
So we can't divorce the government response with the media response. They're tied in with each other. Saeed Al-Shahabi, one of the favorite words of the US President Donald Trump, which seems to be being repeated in the Arab world as well, is fake news. I took a look at Twitter accounts, both in English and Arabic, coming from Saudi Arabia. The big driving force was everything that's being reported so far is fake news. If there's no independent media, if there's very little independent media, and we're relying on social media now, what impact has that had on the narrative in the Arab world about Jamal Khashoggi's case?
Well, the fake media has been there for some time, especially after 2011. But at the same time, the people are being muted because of the their economic situation. But even as you mentioned about the social media has become, in the last 2 years at least, or 3 years, especially in the Gulf, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia. These two countries, and in the United Arab Emirates, that these three countries have made it so difficult to say anything, to tweet anything against, for example, the war in Yemen. If you, in Bahrain, Nabil Rajab has been there for the past 2-3 years, and he has been sentenced to 5 years because he tweeted against the war, against the Saudi-led aggression on Yemen. So you cannot say anything if you criticize the government policy in Riyadh. Even in Bahrain, if you criticize the government in Riyadh or in United Arab Emirates, of course, you can criticize as much as you like Qatar, but not any other country. If you do that, then you are sentenced immediately, automatic sentence, custodial sentence of 3 years. Now, the number of tweeters, the people who use Twitters in the three countries, have dropped in the last 3 years because of these harsh sentences against anyone who tries to speak outside the official sphere. So the social media now is only giving either meaningless, useless, peripheral news or fake news. This is what the Saudi media has done in the last week or so. They have said nothing. They have just clinched to the official question about Khashoggi, but then they started their counter-attack on the international media, on the West, and that there is a conspiracy against Saudi Arabia, not touching upon the issue itself, the issue of Khashoggi. Where is he? What happened to him? They never mention, they don't talk about it inside the Saudi, in the Saudi media. In fact, some of them have said some ridiculous claims. Qatar has killed him. Iran has killed him. So it is so pathetic that sometimes you really feel so much down and upset that our situation in the Arab world has come so low in public opinion, in terms of public opinion, in terms of awareness, in terms of how much the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Bahrainis are trying to mute everybody who calls for reform. Look, yesterday 7 people were killed by Israelis in their peaceful protest. Who cares? Who talks about it?
Well, certainly, I think that has been reported on our channel. Let me just bring in Daoud Khattab here. You talk about an independent media. You talk about the need for an independent media. But social media can't be controlled, and it's now becoming a space for conspiracy theory, for fake news, and simply just to argue a viewpoint and narrative. Where does the Arab world go? This has been a problem in the West for a very long time. But how does the Arab world deal with this?
Well, we have to remember Jamal Khashoggi was writing in Washington Post, so it's a kind of example to you where people have found refuge in exile in American and European media, or in Arab media based in Europe and America, and social media, obviously, in using pseudonames or other things. But I want to point something else which I think has been missing. The president of the U.S. has been a harsh critic of American media, and he has been also speaking about the media being the enemy of the people. And I think this is something that has not been given enough attention. And I think it has given or emboldened different autocratic regimes around the world to dismiss any kind of immunity to journalists and feel like they can do whatever they want with impunity because they know that the American president thinks that they're the enemy of the people. So why can't we consider them also the enemies of the people? So I think we have a really big problem in this value structure. We don't have a reference point today to say the U.S. and the First Amendment is really the beacon of freedom, because look at what the president is saying. We have to look to Europe for guidance. Where do we look for guidance as to what is our model for independent media? The media has become expensive. The media has become so difficult to own independently. And yes, social media is inexpensive. Online media is inexpensive, but people are being harassed for what they write and post on social media and online media. There is cyber crime laws in every country. In our country, in the UAE, you have a Jordanian who's spending 3 years in jail because he wrote something against the UAE government on social media. So there is a fight for the minds and hearts of people. And the media, unfortunately, both the traditional, the online, and social media, is the battleground where we're trying to fight for the right to speak truth to power. And truth to power means that you really have to have independent owned media and journalists who have independence in what they write. And the problem is many journalists have to toe the line of whoever their editor or publisher is because they want to live. And the publishers tend to be either governments or pro-government media or media owned by commercial companies that are in bed with governments. And so there isn't a lot of outlets that you can really say this is an independent outlet. As you said, social media is one area, but that, it's a very kind of diverse and divided kind of outlet.
Let me
But
bring
many
in
people are
Mohammed
finding
Al-Masri
refuge
here.
there.
This is quite interesting because you're teaching the next generation of students in journalism. You need to speak truth to power. That's the only way power will respond. We've seen the lack of response from the Arab governments over this issue. If there was a free media, we may have seen a much stronger response to the Jamal Khashoggi case. What do you tell your students?
That's complicated. That's a long story. I mean, one thing that I tell them is to be safe. First of all, I mean, you have to understand your limits, unfortunately. So if you're reporting on the ground today from Cairo, for instance, the unfortunate reality is that you kind of have to be careful. So there's almost two sets of lessons here. Are you in London or Washington, or are you in Cairo or Riyadh? That's just an unfortunate reality. We have to take that into account when we're teaching our students. I do want to piggyback off something that the other guests have said. I think it's important to note that the Saudis could have targeted any number of people. There are a lot of people who are critical of Saudi policy, either in Yemen or vis-a-vis the blockade against Qatar, their position on the Arab Spring. But they chose to target a journalist, and not only a journalist, but somebody who was living in exile. And I think the message here is very clear, that they do not tolerate any sort of dissent from their own, regardless of where they are. And we have to remember that there are quite literally thousands of people living in exile, not just Saudis. I'm talking here more broadly about this axis, this Saudi, Egyptian, Emirati axis. There are thousands of people living in exile in London, in Washington, all throughout the United States, Canada, in Turkey. And the message here is that you have to watch your back. You have to be very careful about the things that you're saying.
That's an incredibly interesting point, because everything that's been talked about when it came to Jamal Khashoggi's safety and when it came to how he was operating is all come from the West. Journalist safety has been incredibly important. We are seeing an increasing amount of journalists being killed, being attacked, particularly when it comes to speaking out against some elements of the Russian state, for example, in the West. And now we're seeing this happening in the Arab world as well. I just want to bring in Dawood Kutab from Amman over here. If we're all running scared, if the dissidents are running scared, if the activists are running scared, if the journalists are all running scared, living in the West, what hope does that have for any critical voices?
Well, I think there is hope. I don't think we should, look at the glass half empty. There is serious efforts by social media, civil society, and social media and online media is providing some refuge. We have also newly developed media outlets that are certainly, definitely independent, community-based media outlets. Maybe they're not as powerful like major TV stations, but there are voices that are being said. People are listening, and this voice is being heard. Now, the problem is with the big media outlets, you really cannot do it on a shoestring budget. You really need huge budgets to keep a television station running or a satellite station. But there is now enough outlets, I think, for people to express themselves. What we really need is independent journalists. We need people who can speak truth to power and who have the minimum of economic support. And I think that's where we have to work a lot more on, is find ways to support independent journalists who are speaking truth to power and provide them with the sustenance, because sometimes people have to toe the line, not because they believe in what they're writing, but because they have to feed their kids. And the economic part of journalism is really something that we don't talk about enough, but it's a major issue for journalists who are trying to make ends meet and have to sometimes work for media outlets that they don't believe in or that doesn't give them enough space. And I always tell people, don't say the wrong things. If you can't say what you believe in, at least don't say it, but don't say the wrong things.
Now, you can't divorce the media from the government, and the Arab government response has been almost complete silence. A quick answer from each of you. Is there anybody, and I'll start with you, Mohammed Al-Masri, is there anybody, any government that can either stand up to Riyadh or work their way around it and develop an independent response?
I think that's a complicated question. It's a political science question. I'm not necessarily a political scientist. I will say that I think that there has to be a kind of coalition. So we see this kind of Qatari, Turkish alliance, but I think that there needs to be a lot more, there are a lot more voices need to be kind of on board. I think that they need to loop more governments into that mix. Unfortunately, the Saudi influence, the Egyptian influence is quite vast. They've spent, both of those governments in particular, and also the Emirati government, they've spent tens of millions of dollars lobbying on Downing Street, in Washington, and really all over the world. And so you're swimming upstream, so to speak.
Saeed al-Shahabi, is there any government that can take the place of Riyadh and stand up and offer hope to both the media and in order to be independent?
2 points I want to mention. First of all, you asked the question which is very relevant to my case, myself, as a dissident from Bahrain, and as a person who stands every week for the past 7.5 years with my colleagues outside the Saudi embassy in London to protest and to call for the Saudis to pull their, and the Emiratis, of course, to pull their troops out of Bahrain. So we are scared. We are really, really scared after what has happened to Mr. Khashoggi. And if he was to be killed in the embassy in Bahrain, nobody would have raised an eyebrow. But the poor man had paid for with his life. God bless his soul. Now I am scared with my other colleagues. The Egyptians, I know them, also have become scared because many of them are in Turkey, and they have expressed a lot of reservations about the situation. Now, as for the other question you mentioned, I believe that there should be a strong alliance between, of course, Qatar and Turkey, and then they should extend that to Iran, to Pakistan, to Indonesia. These are and probably to Algeria. These are the countries that have big populations, and they have now adopted a slightly different approach to politics than a few years ago. They are more independent of Saudi Arabia. And I think only such an alliance, Arab-Muslim alliance, that could bring some hope. But of course, I will always.
We are running out of time there, Saeed. Let me just al-Shahabi. Let me bring in Dawood Khattab here. So it's not one government. Our guests are saying it has to be an alliance of Arab and perhaps Muslim world governments that stand up to Riyadh. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, we have a problem in that the Qatari-Turkish alliance has been painted as a kind of a Muslim Brotherhood alliance. And I think you're given a choice that you don't really like. You want the army of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, or you want the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think we have to find a way to create a third narrative, or to actually maybe negate the existing narrative that Qatari and Turkish is not a pro-Muslim.